The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It turns out that there are U.S. allies that are investigating Donald Trump. The great Kurt Eichenwald from Newsweek, who we've had on the program before, has revealed some stunning new developments about the Trump administration's dealing with foreign leaders and how European intelligence agencies are trying to track it all. And it turns out that as part of intelligence operations against the Trump staff, at least one unnamed U.S. ally has intercepted a significant amount of communication between Trump staff and Russian government officials. Now, you might say, well, David, you reported this to us yesterday. No, what I reported yesterday was that U.S. intelligence had based their conclusion that the Trump team and Russia had been in touch during the campaign based on intercepted data they had obtained. But what I'm telling you now is that U.S. allies, other countries, have also intercepted such information, which has led them to, of course, the same conclusion. And earlier this week, of course, it was uncovered that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn made numerous phone calls to Russia while President Obama was still president to talk to them in part about sanctions. Michael Flynn denied that they talked about sanctions. Mike Pence went out and said, hey, they didn't talk about sanctions. It turns out that that was a lie. But now other countries, U.S. allies, are also involved in the obtaining and procuring of similar data. Newsweek sources who have direct knowledge of the situation said that these interceptions include at least one correspondence between Flynn and an official within the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. Again, foreign agencies, foreign intelligence now corroborating what American intelligence has come out and said. It's not clear if these revelations refer to the phone calls specifically to Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak, which led to Michael Flynn's ultimate and eventual resignation, or if it's something new. But again, the story is the same. This other country's intelligence agency is saying that the interceptions are also not only limited to phone calls. We know that the intelligence operations by American allies began in August when Britain, again, Britain is not necessarily the country we're talking about, but we know that in August, Britain did receive intelligence that the Trump campaign was communicating with Russia. So now, for all of the Trumpists who are falling in line with Donald Trump's proclamation that we just can't trust our own intelligence agencies, we also now have foreign intelligence agencies, but not from rival or antagonistic countries, but from American allies who are saying they have figured out the exact same thing. Multiple European NATO governments have been conducting similar intelligence operations related to Donald Trump and communications with Russia. There's also an as of yet unnamed Baltic country which has been conducting intelligence operations against the Trump organization because they're afraid that a U.S.-Russia friendship might threaten the sovereignty of Baltic states. So this is not coming from some amorphous and vague desire to hurt Trump or take him down. At least with regard to this Baltic state, they are seeing what seems like a growing friendship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that is concerning to them with regard to their own national security. Of course, Newsweek's sources cited by Kurt Eichenwald in the article I'm referencing here spoke on the condition of anonymity, because obviously they don't have the authority to disclose any of this information, and they are worried that Donald Trump and his team, which are have been demonstrated time and again to be incredibly unstable, might try to retaliate against their governments. And one of the sources says that this intelligence is being spread all around NATO intelligence agencies. Unclear how much of it is being shared with American intelligence agencies. Think about what's going on, Pat. We now have learned, number one, Donald Trump is aggressively attacking the credibility of American intelligence agencies. I think that that's risky. I'm going to talk about that later. We've also learned that American intelligence agencies, because they are aware, or at least fearful of, how much of an open door there is between the Trump White House and Russia, they are withholding information from Donald Trump. And we've now learned that foreign intelligence agencies from allies of the US are withholding information from American intelligence, again, because they are worried about how much is in their interest to reveal. This is, you mentioned yesterday, I think it was going back to J. Edgar Hoover, this sort of level of disconnect or distress between the White House and intelligence agencies. We have a stunning situation here, don't we?
Well, I think it's great that foreign governments are looking into this because maybe our own intelligence agencies could be more tentative or reserved about criticizing the Trump administration, especially when their jobs could be at stake. But with regards to foreign governments, I mean, they don't have as big of a dog in the fight. I mean, Trump could threaten certain things like pulling out of NATO, for example, or starting some sort of trade war. But I think the risk is far lower with them.
Well, on the one hand, we have European nations that seem to know more about what's going on in the White House than certain American branches of government do, who bizarrely, maybe not bizarrely, but distressingly seem unwilling to look into Donald Trump's ties with Russia. Congress has rejected the probing of Donald Trump's relationships and business partnerships with other countries, or the Trump staff's relationship with Russia, et cetera. And in addition to this, you have what I think you're right in terms of some of these countries don't necessarily have a dog in the fight in terms of Trump versus Clinton or whatever sort of micro thing we have going on. But the Baltic state example is a good one, which is some of these countries might see what seems to be a very, very increasingly clear friendship between the White House and the Kremlin that is concerning to them with regard to sort of their own national security and their own place within the geopolitical world. Republicans need to stop the political defensiveness and start looking into what is going on here. They are defending a guy because he has an R in front of his name at the risk of ignoring potential serious corruption here. We seem to be sort of living in a movie. And in fact, if this were a Hollywood script, I almost feel like we would see it and say, we've got to tone it down because this just isn't believable. It's actually 2017 American politics and it's going on and we're going to continue covering it. I want to talk a little bit about hypocrisy, and it's not the usual hypocrisy from the American right. It's actually hypocrisy from the American Democratic Party. Let me set it up for you. Donald Trump has only been in office at this point about 26 days, okay? And during those 26 days, there have been a ton of different leaks, okay, ranging from Donald Trump doesn't think the towels on Air Force One are soft enough to Donald Trump didn't know at 3 a.m. whether a weak dollar or a strong dollar was better for America. So he called former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, a guy who has no economic knowledge whatsoever, to ask him what he thinks, to leaks like finding out that Donald Trump is demanding memos on a single page in bullet point format, mostly with pictures and maps, because he doesn't like reading this stuff. And now, the real reason that Michael Flynn was forced to resign was because, again, someone in intelligence leaked the contents of his calls to Russian officials. Potentially a crime was committed there. We're not exactly sure. But what's clear is there were just out and out lies. Michael Flynn denying that the issue of Russian sanctions came up during those conversations. It turns out that they did. And as a result of the leak, Michael Flynn is gone. So let me first remind you of the obvious and hilarious double standard with regard to leaks and intelligence from Donald Trump and Republicans. During the 2016 election, Republicans didn't seem to mind that DNC emails were being hacked and leaked, that information related to Hillary Clinton's email server was being hacked and leaked. And they would say constantly, hey, don't worry about how it was leaked or the legality of the leaks or whether hacking took place. Just focus on the content and what we're learning. That's all that matters. That was the line from Republicans during the 2016 election. And in a general sense, I sort of agree with the sentiment. We should be focusing on what the content reveals to us. So now we have total and utter hypocrisy from the Trump administration. Republicans all of a sudden, after we're learning so much about the Trump relationship with Russia as a result of leaks, Republicans now are saying, hey, ignore the content of the leaks. We need to be focusing on the fact that someone in intelligence leaked this stuff. We need to be looking into whether hacking took place. With anything that benefits the Republican Party, they look the other way when it comes to the illegal or morally dubious procuring or disclosing of information. But when it's something that doesn't benefit them, they want to ignore the content and focus on the legality or the moral sort of circumstances of the information. Fine, we know about that double standard. Unfortunately, there are many establishment Democrats that are guilty of the exact same thing, and it's really not being discussed too much. Right now, Democrats are singing the praises for the reality that this very damning information about the Donald Trump staff and connections with Russia, et cetera, is being leaked. But it was only one administration ago, under President Barack Obama, a Democrat, that many Democrats were condemning the actions of many people like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, et cetera. Those leakers at the time, particularly Edward Snowden, were undermining a Democratic White House, and many Democrats, not all, but many Democrats were emphasizing the illegality of the leaks above and beyond what did we find out. And many Democrats had the position that, yes, this is important for us to know, but we have the rule of law. We cannot commend crime. We cannot commend the disclosure of classified or secret information. That's the exact position of Republicans right now that Democrats are criticizing. And we can't allow, partisanship to fog our principles. Beneficial leaks are beneficial leaks. You can say, and I've said this actually quite often, Pat, as you've heard me say, I don't commend or suggest the breaking of the law, period. However, when we have information, and I've applied this across the board, we should look at the subject matter, the content, and the believability of that information. That should be the focus. Leaks aren't automatically less righteous if they occur when a Democratic president is in the White House.
Right. I tend to agree with you. And you have to be consistent because otherwise it just comes off as if you're playing for Team Democrat or Team Republican. I mean, with regards to leaks, I think the information that comes out of them is more important. And I think, honestly, leaking information and being a whistleblower can be justified if you're doing so in the American interest. Now, there may be some penalties those people have to pay, but if it's worth it to them, I mean, I think that can be a good thing.
And I've made the distinction before, and I'm sure some people will email me and they'll say, David, hold on a second, though. You've distinguished between types of leaks in the past based on how the information was obtained. Let me repeat what I've said in the past. When we talk about a leaker versus a whistleblower, Chelsea Manning exposed actions that were against the law or the Army field manual, the way that the Army on paper says it conducts itself, whereas Edward Snowden leaked information that, while we may find it deplorable or spying techniques that are ineffective, it was legal by statute at the time. So that's a distinction I've made. That still doesn't change whether we should focus on the content or not. It's a separate conversation from if and whether there should be legal repercussions for the leaker/whistleblower. Send me your thoughts about this. A lot of people emailing me and asking me to address what they're seeing as this hypocrisy double standard from some Democrats. I'm glad to do it. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Let me know what you think.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Stacy Jones. Stacy, thank you sincerely. We are viewer and listener funded media. We have some advertising revenue, but most of our revenue comes directly from the audience. People who want the show to continue can go to davidpakman.com/membership and say, I'm going to sign up for $6 a month or $60 for the year. And if those prices are too high, use the coupon code IVoted17 to get a pretty major discount off of any membership that you want. Also, if you ever shop on Amazon, please stop by davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop to send us a little kickback. And lastly, David Pakman Show coffee, as well as t-shirts and sweatshirts and bumper stickers, all available at davidpakman.com/gear. Just a couple extra ways that you can support the work that we do. This morning, as I often do, I was checking out some of the discussions among our audience on our Reddit discussion forum, now 2,500 strong, 2,500 of our viewers and listeners regularly participating there. You can check it out at davidpakman.com/Reddit, and I hope that you will subscribe. Let's go through just a few of the interesting stories I found this morning on the forum. Number one, there's a post from J473. Titled, "The Media is Really Scaring Me Right Now." And it's a pretty good explanation of why this user is sort of scared about what's going on with corporate media and bias and lack of objectivity. And it's triggered a really big discussion, 29 comments as of this morning, and I think there's already more. And it's a really good and important conversation. I would encourage you to check it out. Also, from our Reddit discussion forum, a link to a tweet from Jeremy Scahill, who has said he is backing out of an appearance on Real Time with Bill Maher because Milo Yiannopoulos, the sort of alt-right poster child, I don't even know what to call him, the alt-right provocateur, we could call him, Milo Yiannopoulos, is going to be on Real Time with Bill Maher, and Jeremy Scahill saying he does not want to participate as a result of that. A lot of conversation going on about that. I'm going to review that again later and sort of see where people are on that issue. Shireen Summer, user Shireen Summer, posted a link to an article talking about the European rise of populist parties and how some of them are inspired by Donald Trump. A very interesting article that I would encourage you to read, and one of the many interesting things on our Reddit discussion forum. An interesting question from a user on our Reddit called Balder93, reaching out to people who voted third party in the 2016 election and saying, would you do it again if you had the chance? Are you planning to vote third party in 2020? And it's a really interesting conversation about how people are feeling about third party votes after what took place in the 2016 election with Donald Trump defeating Hillary Clinton, practically speaking, because of 77,000 votes across 3 states. And then lastly, I don't exactly remember what this is about. There's a post from FTND33 on our Reddit discussion forum, which is called, "Is David Still Thinking About Getting a Firearm?" And they go on to say, "I was completely shocked when I heard David say he was considering purchasing a gun." I don't exactly remember what this is in reference to. I do remember at some point saying it had crossed my mind in certain situations to say, should I look into getting a firearm? And I think I mentioned at one point that I thought it would be interesting for the show to sort of do a mini documentary of me going through the process to show how easy or difficult it would end up being. But I don't remember actually saying I'm thinking about getting a gun in practice. Do you remember anything like this, Pat?
Well, I know that we've talked about you shooting guns, but not necessarily owning them. And I know it's also very difficult to get a gun here in Boston. Liberal gun ownership has actually increased quite significantly since the election. And I wonder if this Reddit user here is suggesting that that's the reason why you may be trying to get one.
Now, you grew up, Pat, in a town outside of Boston, certainly more conservative than Boston, certainly a place where it's easier to have firearms. Did you ever think about getting a firearm?
It's never been an interest of mine. I've never shot a gun. I probably should, because I think it would increase my credentials as a liberal to talk about the topic, but I just have no urge to do it, honestly.
Yeah, interesting. I know that there is lots of self-described progressives in our audience who do own firearms, and I have never even implied that by virtue of having a firearm, you are implicitly more conservative. I think that political ideology and individual decisions to own or not own guns, sort of at the abstract level, are two separate things. Of course, it's undeniable that the overwhelming majority of so-called gun activists are politically more conservative. Join us on Reddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. I'm on there daily. Pat checks it out, and a lot of interesting stuff happening there. Hey, I need to present to you evidence from something I am calling Soupgate. After the Tuesday show, I was later on in the day just reviewing clips, and I often like to take a look at how was the lighting, how were all the graphical elements, and I noticed that there was something very bizarre on my face as I was watching the clips. And after noticing that, I went to the mirror that was closest to where I was at the time and realized that I had a big red dot on my chin. And I leaned in and got very, very close to the mirror and realized that some of my beet soup, known as borscht, that I had earlier that day for lunch, apparently had splashed onto my face. And I did the entire show with about a half-inch red dot of dried borscht on my face. And what was stunning, and I'm showing you some of the pictures here with sort of successively greater zooms on what it was that was on my face there. I texted Pat and I asked him, "Hey, I had this thing on my face the entire time." And what did you say, Pat? That you mentioned it, but you thought it was a pimple, so you didn't want to offend me by bringing it up?
Well, I noticed something there. It was very, very subtle. But yeah, I didn't want to mention it because I didn't know if it was a scratch or a blemish or something. And of course, we were talking during pre-production, but I was, looking directly into your eyes, and I didn't want to offend you in any way by staring directly at it.
It's sort of like that scene in one of the, I think, Austin Powers movies where Fred Savage plays a guy with a huge mole and everybody's trying to look away from it. That's effectively what I think was going on. It crossed my mind that this was sort of like a passive aggressive thing from Pat, because since Pat's vegan, that day on the show, I had put up a picture of a corned beef sandwich that I had at Michael's Deli, a Jewish style deli in Brookline, Massachusetts. And it occurred to me, Pat, that maybe you were taking it out on me by allowing me to do the entire show with borscht on my face.
Oh yeah, totally. You figured it out there. I mean, I think it just clearly we have to get some hair and makeup people on the show.
Yeah, or at least I need to look in the mirror before I sit down in front of the camera. So Soupgate, fortunately, has not taken down the show so far, and I hope we'll be able to persevere. We've talked on the show before about the federal government having sued the Trump Organization back in 1973 for race discrimination, and I've also talked about it being a really bad idea for Donald Trump to go to war with the intelligence community when it's abundantly clear that they have a ton of damaging material about Donald Trump, as we are learning almost every day. The Justice Department accused the company that was run by Donald Trump and his father, Fred Trump, of violating the Fair Housing Act by refusing to rent apartments to Black and Puerto Rican people. Here's the lawsuit on screen for people who are watching with us. And the FBI, lo and behold, what coincidental timing, has now released almost 400 pages of records from that investigation. And the details, while not surprising because we sort of had a sense of what this lawsuit was about, are hugely disturbing. The documents reveal that Black people were often told that no apartments were available when they would call looking for apartments or show up looking for apartments. At the exact same time, white people would call or show up looking for apartments, and all of a sudden there were plenty of apartments available. The Black people who were accepted into potentially acquiring apartments from the Trump Organization were being charged significantly more money than were white people. And the FBI file, which again is stunning, includes dozens of interviews with tenants and management and employees. There's a doorman at a Trump building in Brooklyn who was quoted as saying, "A supervisor told me me that if a black person came to 2650 Ocean Parkway and inquired about an apartment for rent, and he was not there at the time, that I should tell the person who was inquiring about renting an apartment that rent was twice as much as it really was in order that he could not afford the apartment. Then there's another Trump employee who said Fred Trump came to me and said he wanted to get rid of black people from the building by telling them that cheap housing was available elsewhere for only a $500 down payment, which Fred Trump would personally be willing to pay to prevent black people from renting at his apartment. Of course, in total and normal and predictable Trump style, the Trump organization responded to the federal lawsuit with their own $100 million lawsuit against the government for defamation that was obviously dismissed in court. The lawsuit against the Trumps was settled with a consent decree, which made it so that the Trump organization didn't have to admit fault. Pretty common thing in a lot of these lawsuits that takes place, but they were required to put in a bunch of safeguards to prevent further racial discrimination. Now, this came up during one of Donald Trump's debates with Hillary Clinton in 2016, and Trump defended himself not by denying. He didn't say, we didn't racially discriminate. What he said instead was he bragged that he was able to solve the lawsuit without having to admit fault. I'll remind you just a few seconds from that debate with Hillary Clinton.
Does it. Now, as far as the lawsuit, yes, when I was very young, I went into my father's company, had a real estate company in Brooklyn and Queens, and we, along with many, many other companies throughout the country, it was a federal lawsuit, were sued. We settled the suit with no admission of guilt. It was very easy.
So clearly, if you're Trump, you should not be messing with our intelligence agencies. It's abundantly clear they have a lot on you. If only James Comey and the FBI, when they were doing letters and press conferences about Hillary Clinton's email scandal, had mentioned, oh, by the way, we're also investigating Donald Trump for a whole bunch of stuff, including ties to Russia. Alas, that did not happen. And alas, Donald Trump won by 77,000 votes in 3 traditional swing states. Discuss this with us on Reddit, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Andrew Torrez from the Opening Arguments podcast joins me next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Andrew Torrez, who's a graduate of Harvard Law School just over the river from us in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's been practicing law for 21 years and is also the co-host of the Opening Arguments Show, the legal podcast that helps you make sense of the news. Andrew, it's so great to talk to you today. I want to start by talking a little bit about some of the terms that have been ascribed to Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. And some of these terms include that he is an originalist, that he has a textualist interpretation of the Constitution. You see a lot of these terms as sort of code when it comes to analyzing judicial philosophy, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. So first, David, thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to it. With respect to originalism and textualism, which is what originalists like to call themselves, now that there is some pushback on originalism, as a bit of a dirty word. I mean, it is my view that originalism is internally incoherent as a judicial philosophy. It is way outside the mainstream, liberal or conservative, as a method of jurisprudence. And it should be disqualifying if you're going to serve on the Supreme Court.
And when we talk about the way in which the term a judicial activist is sort of thrown around, it seems that on the political spectrum, you have both sides using that term to mean drastically different things. So let's talk a little bit about that. When we step back from the politics a little bit and say, okay, where is the line drawn between a judge interpreting the law and a judge doing activism? Is there some specific definition that we can apply to some of these terms?
Yeah, I think there is. So judicial activism has at its core a real criticism, right? There's a separation of powers based criticism, which is to say that the legislature is supposed to make the laws and the judiciary is supposed to interpret them. And so the phrase judicial activism originally meant when the judiciary took an existing base of law and grafted something completely novel on top of it. Okay, and that's really important because the right wing has really hijacked judicial activism. I mean, in ways that are in some cases laughable, right? And it has now become, if you hear on Fox News the phrase judicial activism, that just means a decision by a judge that reaches a non-conservative outcome. Right. So, for example, it was tossed around in the Kitzmiller versus Dover decision against, which was the battle over intelligent design in Pennsylvania, and the judge was, a George W. Bush appointee and a long-standing conservative, and he predicted in his opinion that the critics were going to call the decision activist, and in fact, the Discovery Institute released a press release after that decision came out, which said this is activist judge rules against us. So it's become kind of a generic slander against judicial opinions that the right doesn't like. But it's my view that that the core that originalism, which we can sort of define and talk about, but that opens the path for the most possible conservative judicial activism, right? That is for conservative political ideologues to reach the results they want in particular cases.
And it's sort of almost that by definition, if you think about what we mean when we say conservatism, and then when you think about the idea that you are going to apply a document literally that was written hundreds of years ago to life on Earth in, for example, 2017, it's sort of by definition the most conservative possible way that a judge could interpret law, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, there are two things that kind of immediately come to mind there. Right? The first is that the Constitution, by and large, is not written like, for example, like speed limit laws, right? Like the speed limit says you can drive 65 miles an hour on I-95. It's a bright line rule. If you're traveling 66, you're violating the law. If you're traveling 65, you're okay, right? Almost nothing in the Constitution is written that way. Most of the Constitution is written with deliberately expansive phrases, right? So like the Fifth Amendment protects you from the deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? Well, what's liberty? What's a process? How much of it are you due? All of those are things that it's very, very clear the Founding Fathers intended the judiciary to expand and explain what those terms meant. So taking an overly narrow view is inconsistent with the text of the Constitution. And it's also inconsistent with, as far as we can tell, the writings of the founders themselves, right? Like we have the Federalist Papers. We know the people who wrote the Constitution, what they intended for the judiciary to do, and they did not intend for the judiciary to fetishize either the text of the Constitution or the writings of the Founding Fathers. Right. So if you want to look back to what the Founding Fathers thought, they didn't think, hey, put us on a pedestal and never change stuff. They thought, we're giving you a framework that contains expansive terms, and we want that to fill out over time. And there are a number of, sort of really clear examples of this where originalism just gets you, absurd results.
Can you give us a couple of those examples? I think that'd be interesting.
Yeah, sure. So, for example, the Eighth Amendment protects individuals against cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, so what is cruel and unusual punishment? There have been two different originalist takes on that phrase. Okay, and one is to say cruel and unusual punishment is anything that the Founding Fathers thought was cruel and unusual punishment in 1787. The problem with that is that's almost nothing, right? Like in 1787, it was perfectly fine to flog people for public hangings, for pillorying people in the stocks, for breaking people on the wheel. Like the last law prohibiting breaking on the wheel, that is, taking a paddle wheel and kind of waterboarding somebody on a certain. I mean, it's torture, right? And the last law to prohibit that was passed in the 20th century, I think, in Rhode Island, right? So, so if you go by that view, then the Eighth Amendment literally means nothing. It does not prohibit torture. It means if, Alabama tomorrow decided we were going to put blasphemers in the stocks, then they would not have a right under the Eighth Amendment. And that's just that should strike you as absurd.
And to jump in just for 1 second, Andrew.
Yeah,
so what
ahead.
you're basically saying is, if you're interpreting the Constitution in sort of this originalist, textualist way, based on what the founders meant at the time that it was written, you're talking about, hey, at the time, these are punishments that would have been allowed. Thus, a textualist interpretation would say they'd be allowed today.
Yeah, and if I know you have lawmakers who listen to your show. If anybody on the Senate Judiciary is listening to the show, I would love for them to ask Neil Gorsuch what punishment specifically he thinks the Eighth Amendment forbids, because there is no consistent originalist, textualist way to say that the Eighth Amendment forbids anything. Other than, sort of bizarre hypothetical. And I would ask follow-up questions. Say, does it prohibit public hangings? Does it prohibit whipping? Does it prohibit pillorying? Does it prohibit the stocks? And there's no consistent way to answer that question. I can tell you how Antonin Scalia answered it. Antonin Scalia said, no, it doesn't. Now, mind you, he didn't say that until after he'd been confirmed by the Senate and was sitting on the Supreme Court. But that's the only consistent view you can have. If you track that, and in fact, Scalia wrote an opinion in which he parsed out, in which he said that life imprisonment without parole for the crime of passing a bad check was not a disproportionate punishment prohibited by the Eighth Amendment. And his analysis was, and I'm not making this up, right? You can look up the opinion that it prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And while mandatory minimum sentences for minor crimes may indeed be cruel, they are not unusual in the constitutional sense. So in fact, I think if you Google unusual in the constitutional sense, you'll get the opinion. And it's just, it's just preposterous, but that's where that leads you. And, it used to be the case, right? In 1987, the Democrats mounted a successful opposition to Robert Bork on the Supreme Court. There was no question that Bork was intelligent. There was no question he was serving with some distinction as a judge on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, on the United States Circuit Court for the D.C. Circuit, which is a feeder circuit to the Supreme Court. Clarence Thomas was on that court. Antonin Scalia was on that court. So there was no question Bork was a smart guy. But the hearings focused on the fact that he had an ideology that was way outside the mainstream of American jurisprudence. And it was based on his ideology that he was rejected and that Reagan was sort of forced to come back. Eventually, there was a candidate in the middle who had some kind of bizarre personal struggles. But eventually he came back with Anthony Kennedy, right, who was a moderate. And the Democrats in the Senate said this seat, needs to go to a moderate. Can't go to somebody with an extremist view of jurisprudence, and I'd like to see the Democrats do that again.
Andrew, in the limited time we have left, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this constant sort of meme that shows up in confirmation hearings for Supreme Court justices, which are questions of sort of differing specificity about abortion and Roe v. Wade. And typically the way it goes is individuals on the confirmation committee will ask some kind of question about the nominee's views on abortion or Roe v. Wade, and you typically get some type of answer where it's this generally a formatted answer of these are issues that may come before the court, and it would be improper for me to prejudge before examining the merits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How did this become such a common thing, and what's the sort of point of that at every confirmation hearing?
Sure. So it's important to remember Roe v. Wade was a 7-2 decision, right? Like this was not a particularly, I don't want to say it wasn't controversial. It was controversial politically, but not judicially, because the Supreme Court had built up a body of jurisprudence concerning what was considered the right to privacy. And privacy is sort of a weird word for it. Because of the colloquial meanings that it has. But essentially, those were decisions recognizing the key right to bodily autonomy and to make decisions about reproduction and childbirth and marriage. And so you had a line of decisions, starting with Griswold v. Connecticut, that said states can't ban contraceptives. right? That you had Loving versus Virginia. States can't outlaw interracial marriage. And so those decisions were at the core of what the court called the right to privacy, which inheres in the 14th Amendment and what was described in Roe v. Wade as sort of the penumbra of the Bill of Rights is today considered a part of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And so if you have the mainstream view of jurisprudence, I stress this, this is the view that liberal judges have it, conservative judges have it, moderate judges have it. As long as you're not an originalist, if you follow sort of the mainstream idea that precedent matters, then you recognize that there's a longstanding history of the right to privacy. And then the Roe decision is perfectly consistent with that, right? You could address it, sort of contours at the edges like the court did, subsequently in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case about 20 years later. But you can't say Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. The only way to say that is to have kind of a radical originalist view that says we can bypass 220 years of jurisprudence and go back to the founding of the country and say, no, we're going to overturn Roe v. Wade. So the non-answer has come about since the Bork hearings as a way for conservative judicial activists who want to reach that end goal of overturning Roe v. Wade, but they don't want to concede in their hearing that that's their goal. They don't want to answer squarely the question of whether there's a right to privacy in the Constitution, because under their philosophy, there isn't. But under the judicial philosophy that, again, I want to stress, like 95% of lawyers, or wherever you are on the political side of the spectrum, adhere to kind of that mainstream view that precedent matters. So that's where that comes from.
Very, very informative. That explains a lot about why we hear that so often. I want to encourage everybody to check out the Opening Arguments Show, the legal podcast that is co-hosted by our guest, Andrew Torrez. Excellent program. And I really appreciate you being on with us today, Andrew.
David, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a blast.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I want to get your thoughts on this. A few people emailed me and they said, hey, David, did you see what happened when Sean Spicer, Trump's White House press secretary, talked about the meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Joe Trudeau? And if you're saying to yourself, why is David saying Joe Trudeau? His name is Justin Trudeau. That's exactly what it is that Sean Spicer said. So there's differing opinions about whether this is Spicer and lack of preparedness or just sort of a verbal glitch. Let's listen to it together and then we'll discuss.
Yesterday, the president had an incredibly productive set of meetings and discussions with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, focusing on our shared commitment to close cooperation.
Okay, so it's unclear whether he said Joe Trudeau or whether he sort of stumbled while saying Trudeau, but this happened more than once throughout the day for Sean Spicer. Is this no small, little thing, doesn't matter, no big deal, or is it part of a broader, constant lack of preparedness from the Trump administration? You've watched this a couple of times, Pat. What do you think?
I think he's just stumbling over the word Trudeau. I mean, he was stammering early on in that sentence. I think he went to say Prime Minister Trudeau, but got stumbled up on the tr part. And I think he just tried to say Trudeau there. That's my take.
I'm not really sure. And the thing is, whether this was just a stumble or not, it was widely reported as Trump press secretary refers to Justin Trudeau as Joe Trudeau. And if it weren't for the fact that there's this longer, we're on day 26 of the Trump administration. It feels like it's been years, if not decades, because of how much craziness has gone on. But there's been a total lack of preparedness from the Trump White House in so many ways. When British Prime Minister Theresa May came to Washington and to the White House, in 3 different places, her first name, Teresa, was misspelled without the H, which in and of itself is a little bit embarrassing to not spell the name of a foreign leader correctly. But it just so happens that Theresa May with no H happens to be a British porn star. So completely embarrassing for the Trump White House. Donald Trump, totally unprepared during phone calls with foreign leaders. He had to pause a phone call with Russian leader Vladimir Putin to ask what the nuclear treaty was that the United States has with Russia, to only then get back on the call and say, oh yeah, Obama started that, I'm against it. Typos and errors everywhere. And then the press secretary appears to say the wrong name for a world leader, and not one from halfway around the world, but one that is just a few hundred miles north of where we are in Boston, Massachusetts. So, I think the thing is, Pat, that there's, again, this broader idea that the White House at every single level is a group of people that are in way over their heads and are messing up in ways that nobody could ever predict. I mean, they're also messing up in the ways that all rational people predicted. But this is sort of low-hanging fruit that you'd think they'd be able to avoid.
Yeah, I guess we'll never really know. I mean, I'm more skeptical about it in this instance, but if true, it kind of goes to this narrative that the people inside the Trump administration don't really know what they're doing and shouldn't be in that position.
Next week, reportedly, Donald Trump will be meeting with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Francois Amsterdam. That is the latest press conference from Sean Spicer. I'm kidding. Please don't email me saying that I'm spreading fake news. That's a joke. It's not real. Donald Trump once again has asserted that massive voter fraud was the reason why he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. This dates back to 2016. Trump has been asserting the election's rigged. He didn't win the popular vote because 3 to 5 million undocumented immigrants voted. People also registered twice, like his own daughter and Steve Bannon and other people associated with him. And he said he would launch an investigation into the matter, again, in spite of there being no evidence to suggest that this is true. In his first meeting in January with lawmakers after being inaugurated as president of the United States, Donald Trump brought it up again, and some of the lawmakers in the room found it a little odd. And then just a few days ago, at a meeting with 10 senators, Donald Trump again brought up this debunked conspiracy theory about 3 to 5 million undocumented immigrant voters. The meeting was supposed to be an effort for the White House to gain bipartisan support for Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch. And Donald Trump opted to go completely off the rails, went on a rant about voter fraud. Of course, despite the fact that he won the presidency, continues to talk about it. This is where it gets really weird. Former New Hampshire Senator Kelly Ayotte was in the meeting, and she lost her reelection campaign in November. And Trump at the meeting said, oh, both Kelly Ayotte and I would have won New Hampshire if it hadn't been for thousands of people who were brought in on buses from Massachusetts to vote illegally in New Hampshire. No evidence for this. And one person present at the meeting said that was followed by what they describe as an uncomfortable silence in the room, because obviously it's all completely made up. And then our new buddy, who channeled Kim Jong-un on the Sunday morning shows over the weekend, Trump's senior advisor, who is 31 years old, Stephen Miller, backed it up on ABC News. Here's what that looked like.
I've actually, having worked before on a campaign in New Hampshire, I can tell you that this issue of busing voters into New Hampshire is widely known by anyone who's worked in New Hampshire politics. It's very real. It's very serious. This morning on this show is not the venue for me to lay out all the evidence.
The president made a statement saying he was the victim of voter fraud, people being bused from Massachusetts and New Hampshire.
The president was.
Do you have any evidence?
If this is an issue that interests you, then we can talk about it more in the future.
Yeah, when Stephen Miller says it's okay to talk about the president's blatant lies, you'll be allowed to talk about them. Wouldn't we have heard about this if it was actually a widely known phenomenon from some source other than the conspiratorial recesses of the internet and Donald Trump, who happens to be president of the United States? It's possible, Pat. It crossed my mind. Maybe it's Stephen Miller who planted this idea originally in Donald Trump's head, because he's the guy who's saying, oh, it's absolutely true, without actually citing any evidence for it.
Right. And what Stephen Miller said there was just horribly unconvincing. I mean, he says that he doesn't have enough time to lay out all of the evidence on a show. But could you just name one piece of evidence, or maybe go back later and put it in the transcript or something, you know? Like,
give us something. Here's another really just bizarre thing, and this goes to the idea that none of this makes any sense. Kelly Ayotte had denounced Trump in 2016, and during this meeting that took place, Donald Trump told Kelly Ayotte he wished that she had campaigned for him and added, "You'd have won in New Hampshire if you had been on my train." That doesn't make any sense. Trump first said that Kelly Ayotte lost because of voter fraud, thousands of people going on buses from Massachusetts to New Hampshire to vote against her and vote against Trump. But then Trump later in the meeting says, actually, you lost because you didn't support me. So which is it? But again, in the bizarro land of Trump conspiracy theories, it doesn't matter that Trump's two ideas are completely self-contradictory. Also from this meeting, senators said that Donald Trump referred to Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas again, which is one of his favorite lines from his campaign. This is the president of the United States at a meeting with senators referring to another senator as Pocahontas. It is off the rails, folks, embarrassingly so. We have a voicemail number. It is 219-2-DAVID-P. Take a listen to this voicemail that came in.
Man, where's Trump when you actually need him? He got all the credit for the carrier deal that he made, but my town just lost its factory, Train, another air conditioning company. And it just shows you Trump can't just do things on a case-by-case basis. He needs to actually implement reform, which will prevent companies across the country from doing this. He can't just talk to one like Carrier and think it's all going to be okay.
Absolutely. This is what I've been saying for a while. Giving money to Carrier is not economic policy, and it's not the free market, and it's not changing the business environment in the United States. Very well said. On the bonus show today, there's a narrative spreading that the intelligence community is getting ready to, quote, go nuclear on Donald Trump. I will talk about that. I'm also going to talk about what a city in Iowa is doing to help the bee problem that we have in the United States, and also stories from my recent visit to the eye doctor. Some interesting stuff went on there. All of that on the bonus show, davidpakman.com/membership to sign up. Coupon code for a major discount is available, davidpakman.com/membership. Coupon code IVoted17.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.